Okay, William.
Wrap it up.
That's what they do at David Letterman, right?
Yeah, that's right. He's Paul.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A special welcome to everybody who's joining us online or watching elsewhere, maybe watching a DVD at home. Thanks for being a part of it. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. And a special welcome to our series with Herb Montgomery, Jesus for Skeptics. We've been through an incredible journey having a look at what this Jesus of the Bible is really like. And so many of us have discovered that he's actually radically different from what we first thought. And so we're going to enjoy looking at another session tonight with Herb. And so thanks for joining us. And I want to invite you up. Herb, let's give him a warm Kiwi welcome as he come back and share with us. Thank you, Herb.
Thank you. Well, tonight's another double handout night. We have a lot of ground to cover, and so I want to jump right into it. I want to say from the very beginning, as we've looked at each night, we've seen the ethical teachings of Jesus, and we've been asking the question if there's any relevance in them still for our world today in the 21st century. And how many through just the three that we've looked at, the radical inclusivity, the nonviolence, and his helping the poor and his narrative against greed, how many have seen that those do contain intrinsic value, that they could be beneficial to our world today? Tonight, we're actually not going to look at an ethic as much as the actual story, the narrative itself. I'm going to ask you not to try to extract religious beliefs from the story tonight, but just listen to what the story's telling us. If it helps you to put yourself into that place that we mentioned on night number 1, where we said the Cinderella story, all the fairy tales, nobody argues over whether they actually took place in history or not. They just ask, what's the story truth? What's the story telling us? That's what I'm going to ask you to do tonight, and hopefully this will make more sense as we go through it. And I'll remind you as we get to certain points so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. But I am convinced Jesus taught, he says, I know you've heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, love your enemies. Do not retaliate against an evil person. If we learn anything about God's justice through the Sermon on the Mount, God is just. If you agree with that, say yes. But God's justice is not retributive. God's justice is not punitive. God's justice is restorative. It's about bringing justice to those that are oppressed, about bringing justice to those that are under the yoke of injustice. It's about taking the violence of the world and putting that to right. I say this from the very beginning. Jesus came not to satisfy an angry God's need for retribution. Jesus came to fulfill a loving God's dream of restoration. And those are two radically different pictures of God. Let's look at it in Galatians 1, verse 4. In Galatians 1:4 it says, who gave himself for our sins so that we would be, if we accept it, would be led into heaven. Is that what it says? Is that what it says? I know we're small tonight. No. What does it say? Paul says, who gave himself for our sins to set us free from the, what's that word? The present evil age. Now don't misunderstand me. Jesus' death saves us from the terrors of the age to come. If you agree with that, say yes. But he didn't just die to save us from the age to come or something in the age to come. He died for our sins to save us from, what does it say? The present evil age as well. How many of you have noticed this week that what Jesus taught has actually, to a large degree, the greatest implication in how the present age is arranged? How many have seen that night after night? He's challenging the present evil age according to the will of God and our Father. What we're going to find in the Jesus story tonight when we look at the narrative is that what we learn about in the story, the Jesus story, his death and his resurrection, we don't find sinners in this story in the hands of an angry God. What we find is a God who is in the hands of angry sinners. And what does that mean? In John 12:20, hold this in your mind. Jesus was not sent into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Or the Greek word there is healed. The healing of the world. Putting the world to right. John 12, starting in verse 20. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies. This is Jesus explaining. If anybody understood why Jesus died, how many would think it would probably, if anybody understood it, it would be Jesus himself? How many would agree with that? He says, this is it. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much what? What's the fruit that he's wanting his own death to produce? Be asking yourself that question. Those who love their life lose it. Those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor. And now my soul is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? What hour is beginning to do? What's about to happen? What's he about to go through that he's troubled over? Talk to me. What's he about to go through? Yeah, the crucifixion. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? He says, no. It is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Underline that. We're going to come back to it before we're done tonight. I don't want to zero in on it yet. It says, then a voice came from heaven, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. And then this whole passage ends with Jesus saying, when? Now is the judgment of this world. Now he mentions someone here. Now the who? The prince of this world will be what? Driven out. And I, when I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. Jesus, in this story, said that this world was under another ruler, under another prince. And some of the fruit that he was hoping his death would produce was that prince would be rejected by us, that we would be driven out, and that we would begin following who instead? That we would leave the way of the Satan, and we would start following Jesus. Now, Satan is not his name. In the Hebrew, it's Ha-Satan, the Satan. Like devil is not his name. We call him the devil. Ha-Satan. What does Satan mean? It's the accuser. How many were here Monday night when we talked about how groups come together, they unify against a marginalized group? It's the way of the accuser. That's the way the present world is arranged. He's wanting us to leave. When you think of just the things that we've talked about this week, of greed and violence and marginalizing the weakest among us. That's the way of the Ha-Satan, the Satan, that he's wanting to draw us away from to follow him instead as the new Prince of Peace. We have 3 kids, as I've told you so many times already. For our youngest 2, we have a rule. I think we live in a pretty sick world. And we have a rule for my 11-year-old daughter and my 6-year-old son: no talking to strangers. How many think in a sick world that's probably a good rule? How many would agree with that? You also realize, though, that I'm telling my 17-year-old, I'm teaching her how to talk to strangers effectively. Now, some would say those are two different rules. Those are two different parents. No, same parent. The child's at two different places. Hopefully you'll see the implications in that. Imagine with me, let's make up a story. This did not really happen, okay? Don't come up to me afterwards and tell me you're sorry that this happened, because it didn't happen. We're just going to make it up. I live in Lewisburg, West Virginia. We were just awarded the coolest small town in America. And it's a very small town, about 3,500 people. And let's say that one day my 11-year-old daughter, she's walking downtown, and she's there just minding her own business, and a stranger walks up to her and begins talking to her, and she doesn't want to hurt the stranger's feelings. She cares about the stranger's feelings, so she doesn't want to be rude. So she talks back. Before she realizes what's going on, they're engaging in a conversation. And before she realizes what's happening, imagine with me that she is following this gentleman back to his car. And imagine that this man kidnaps my 11-year-old daughter. Let that register with you for a moment. As her father, when that comes home to me, can anybody here tonight describe for me what I'm feeling? When I realize this, what am I feeling? Talk to me. Talk to me. For the sake of the people that are at home waiting on you to answer, talk to me. Afraid, yeah, deathly afraid. There's fear. What else? Anguish, yes. Anger, yeah. Every nonviolent bone in my body is being tested. Any other things that I'm feeling? Put yourself in those shoes for a moment. What would you be feeling?
What didn't I teach you?
Yeah, maybe some self-blame. Anything else? Scared? Am I thinking, man, a rule has been broken, and when I get her home, is that what I'm thinking? Is the broken rule and punishing someone for that broken rule even on my radar right now? I'm going to submit to you that I could care less right now about a broken rule. The only thing I care about is someone has stolen my daughter, and I don't care what it takes. I will go to hell and back if need be to rescue her and bring her back home. When I get her back home, will I punish her then? I mean, after all, the rule was broken. Will I punish her then? No. I will submit to you that she will never be punished for that broken rule. I will instead be spending the rest of her life and mine endeavoring to heal her from the nightmare she has been through. What is your picture of God tonight? Why did Jesus come? Because God was primarily concerned with meting out punishment for a broken rule? Or had someone stolen his beloved you, and he was going to go to hell and back to rescue you from him who had taken you captive? This is vital. Look at it, if you will, in Luke 11:21 through 22. It says, when a strong man, fully armed, guards his house, his possessions are safe. Who is this strong man in this parable? Do you know by context? This is an oversimplified definition. But who's the strong man here? Any ideas? Who's the strong man? This is the ruler of this world. This is the enemy. Where does he claim as his possession? Right? That's right. And whom does he claim as belonging to him? All of us. That's right. It says, but when someone stronger attacks and overpowers him, he takes away the armor in which the man trusted and divides up his plunder. Who's the stronger man in this story? This is Jesus. So you have Jesus coming against the enemy. Now, once again, whether you believe in a devil or not, it doesn't matter. Is there a devil mentioned in the story? Is there a devil mentioned in the story? Yes. Did Jesus teach there was a devil? So whether you can prove ontologically there's a devil or not, stay with me. It's still in the story. Are you with me? Here's one of those points where you could get caught up. Is Herb saying there's actually a devil out there? I was doing a series at Princeton where a gentleman came up to me afterwards and he said to me, I have to hand it to you. That is the most beautiful presentation of Jesus' execution that I've ever heard from any Christian, but you've made it harder, not easier for me to believe. I said, why is that? He was an agnostic. He said, because now you're asking me not only to believe there's a God out there, you're asking me to believe that there's a devil too. I don't want you to get sidetracked down that. Just what's the story truth here? And notice, according to the story, did Jesus come to rescue us in the story from an angry God? Or did Jesus come to rescue us from someone or something that had taken us captive? Do you see the story truth here? This is a vital distinction to make, because most of Christianity historically has, intentionally or unintentionally, it doesn't matter, communicated to the world that Jesus died to save us from an angry God. If you can see that historically, say yes. What is the narrative's truth, though, here? The story truth. Jesus never once comes as saying that he's dying to satisfy God. He's dying to save us from the strong man who had taken us captive. Look at it in Luke 4, 5 through 7. It says, the devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant, how many? How many of them? All the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, I will give you all their authority and splendor, for it has been given to whom? To me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours. Now, did Jesus here contest this claim that they'd all been given to him? No. And had Jesus come to rescue the world from under his authority? Yes. But did he come to do it by bowing down to him, or did he come to do it through the long and slow process of a cross? What's the story truth? Keep in mind, 1 John 5:19, the early church taught, we know that we are children of God and that the whole world is under the control of who? That's an interesting, I never see that bumper sticker, by the way. We talked about on Saturday the bumper sticker that says God is in control. I never see the bumper sticker that says the devil is in control. But that's what John says, that the whole world is under the control of who? The evil ones. We have to wrestle with that. Acts 10:38, it says how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good, healing how many? All who were under the power of the who? How many are beginning to see Jesus in the story? The story doesn't say Jesus came to save us from a God who is ticked off. Jesus came to save us from someone we were under the power of, the authority of, someone who had taken us captive. Hebrews 2:14, look in your gray space there. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might satisfy God of all the anger that he feels towards sinners over their sin. Is that what it says? No, it says that he might break the power of him who holds the power of death. That is the who? The devil. Look at it in 1 John 3:8. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy, what does it say? The devil's works. And in John 16:11, Jesus refers to him as what? The ruler of this world. John 14:30, I will not say much more to you, for what does it say? The ruler of this world is coming. And you go back over to Matthew 10:45, Jesus says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a what? A ransom for many. In what scenario do we use the term ransom? Kidnapping. This is what I want you to catch hold of tonight. This is the basis, the narrative basis for why Jesus thought he was dying. He was not dying to quench some anger in God's heart towards you. His death somehow was to rescue you from the way of what the Hebrew narratives called the Hasatan, and to win you back to the way of Jesus. We were on a path that would end in our destruction. He wanted to put us on to the path of life. Why was Jesus crucified? Let's talk about that for a moment. This is where every Hollywood version of the Jesus story, every movie you've ever seen about the Jesus story, every one of them gets it wrong on this. None of them capture why Jesus was killed. There are three sacrificial systems in our world, and to help us get our head around this, let me talk about this for a second. We have political sacrificial systems. Political sacrificial systems, once again, this is one of those narratives where there's scarcity, anxiety. If you were here last night, we're building on that. There's territorialism, and then we use violence to protect that territorialism, all that we've accumulated. And the way that we produce unity is by always having common enemies. There's a sacrificial system politically that is dependent upon violence, someone being sacrificed for our way of life. Economically, we have sacrificial systems where we sacrifice the poor. Remember, there's enough for every man's need, but not every man's greed. And yet, if we want to accumulate, someone's going to have to go without. Are you with me? And so we sacrifice the weaker. That is an economics that is driven by greed. So we have politics dependent upon violence. We have economics dependent upon or driven by greed. And then religion is the third sacrificial system we're going to talk about tonight. Religion, to a large degree, is dependent upon fear of God. That's what drives most of religions. Even I wish I could say that the Christian religion is immune to this, but even the Christian religion and many flavors of it, it's driven by fear, an angry God that you have to appease. Be afraid. Be very, very afraid. Three sacrificial systems: politics dependent upon violence, economics driven by greed, religion dependent upon, based, rooted in fear. Jesus came challenging all three. How many remember the pyramid that we talked about last night? Tonight we're going to start putting together a lot of the pieces that we've covered night after the previous nights. If we talk about sacrificial systems in the form of a pyramid, in politics, our politics are arranged in a pyramid structure. Few at the top benefiting on the many at the bottom. And it's dependent upon violence to keep the many on the bottom. Economics set up in a pyramid structure? Religion as well is set up on a pyramid structure. All of those, depending on which pyramid it is, all of those at the top are dependent upon violence for their place of privilege, greed for their place of privilege, or fear for their place of privilege. What happens when Jesus comes offering a world with no violence, a world with no more greed, a world with no more fear? What happens to those three systems? They're going to collapse. And who's going to suffer the most when those systems collapse? Those at the top. Why do I bring up these three systems? Because I want you to look for them in the story tonight. Who represents economics driven by greed in the story? Do you know? What one person, think of Jesus' execution and resurrection, that story. What's the one person in that story that represents economics driven by greed? Can you think of who it would be? No, not the Jews. One single person. Oh, I was hoping someone would say Judas, and that's close, but Judas was a little bit more nationalistic than he was economic, and I think. But that's a good guess. Can you think of any other one person that represented? He actually had more wealth then Caesar himself and he and Pilate were actually enemies until Jesus. Herod. Herod represents economics driven by greed, if you know anything about him. Who represents politics dependent upon violence in the story? He's the representative of the Roman Empire. Who's the... This, yeah, or yes, but Caesar's not present. Who's Caesar's representative in the story? Pilate. So you have Pilate, you have Herod, and who represents religion dependent upon keeping the people afraid? Yeah, and who's the figurehead of that? Do you remember his name? Caiaphas. I'm hoping, see, this is really why I'm doing this tonight. And I don't want you to feel bad when I say this. The blank stares in the room are actually evident that we need to go through this exercise. Because we know the theology or the religious beliefs that we've derived from the Jesus story narrative, but we don't know the story anymore. Are you with me? The story is very unfamiliar to us. Even those of us who have been Christians for years, we're very unfamiliar with what the story details are, what the story narrative is, and so therefore we can't possibly derive what the story truth is if we've forgotten what the story was. So you have three people, Herod, Pilate, and Caiaphas. Herod represents the economics dependent upon greed. Pilate represents the Roman Empire, politics driven by violence. And Caiaphas represents religion dependent upon fear. All three of them are at the top of their pyramid structures. All three of them come together to exterminate the threat to their way of arranging the world that places them on top. This is, according to the narrative, why Jesus was crucified. It was an unjust execution. Let's jump into it. John 8:44. Jesus says, "You are from your father, the who? And you choose to do your father's desires. He was a what? A murderer from the beginning, and does not stand in the truth, because there is how much? No truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies." All three of these systems, political, economic, and religious, they practice the way of the Satan. Remember, Satan means accuser. And sociologically, what we call this way that they practice, it's called scapegoating. In other words, the way, whether it's political, economic, or religious, we're all competing for which place in the pyramid? The top. And whenever a community, sociologists have been able to see this, whenever a community is competing for that top place, then the unity of that community eventually becomes threatened. It's faced with disintegration or imploding on itself. And the way that unity is restored in these systems, can you think about what happens? They don't know why, but somehow there's always someone that everybody turns on to blame for the problems of that system. And everybody comes back together, unified against that common enemy, whether it be religious. How many have met religious systems where you're bound together by saying, that person's the evil one? How many have met that in religion before? Or how about politics, where people are brought together politically by saying, they're the evil party? How many have ever seen that before? Or economics, where there's great unity because those are the ones causing all the economic problems. Are you with me? This only works if we don't realize we're doing it. In other words, we have to actually think those that we're rallying together against really are evil. If it should be shown that they're innocent, then it won't work. So we have to follow the way of the accuser. Do you see it? If you see it, say yes. But it's a lie. Are you with me? We're believing a lie, and it's a sacrificial system because we're sacrificing someone else for our system to continue. Does that make sense tonight? I've just given you a lesson in sociology. This is what sociologists call scapegoating. This is what all three groups do to guess who? To Jesus. Did Caiaphas feel threatened by Jesus? Did Pilate see that Jesus, though innocent, this was going to be a threat to his position and the Roman, he claimed to be. Did Herod consider Jesus to be a threat? They all came together to scapegoat the innocent party. Do you see it? It's the way of the accuser. Luke 9:22. Jesus wants to win us from this way. We've covered this in previous verses, what we just looked at. He wants to win us from following the ruler of this world, the Hasatan, to following the way of Jesus. But in order for him to do it, he's going to have to become the sacrificed victim of all three of those systems. And I'll show you how it's going to work. He says in Luke 9, the Son of Man must undergo what? Great suffering. He must be, what's that word? Rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. And he must be what? Who killed him? Those three systems. We did. He must be killed, and on the third day be what? What if just part of this happened? What if he was just rejected but not killed? Would that unveil the system? What if he was rejected and killed but not resurrected? Would that unveil the system? Think about it. Have people been sacrificed by these three systems throughout history? And does that change the systems? No, the system just continues, does it not? But what if God should stand in solidarity with one of those victims and bring that victim back to life to prove that he was innocent? The problem is the way we do life here on planet Earth. Jesus wasn't guilty. Would that cause people to wake up and to start reevaluating the way we're doing life? Listen, the way that we do life on planet Earth, if this story is telling us anything, the way that we arrange life presently on planet Earth, if left unchecked, it is capable of killing even who? God himself, if he should show up and threaten these systems. That should be a wake-up call to all of us. Remember, the hope of the Hebrew people was not of one day becoming a disembodied soul in some far-off distant heaven. The hope of the Hebrew people was of one day the Messiah coming and setting all injustice, oppression, and violence to right here on planet Earth. It was about creating change in the here and in the now. In Mark 11, let's dive into the narrative just a little further. Mark 11, it says, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts. He began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables and the money changers and the benches and those selling doves. It would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. Now, was this a fit of temper on Jesus' part? Did he just walk in, see it, and lose it? This is step one, I believe, of nonviolent direct action. And for those of you who have not been here night after night, you'll want to get the DVDs because now we're referencing stuff we've already covered. Remember, Gandhi and Martin Luther King both saw in the Jesus story 3 steps to nonviolent direct action. The first is to provoke the system. For Gandhi, it was salt marshes or burning the passports in South Africa. For King, it was sit-ins and freedom rides and freedom marches. For Jesus, it was, step number 1 was cleansing the temple. This was not a fit of rage because actually just a few verses earlier in Mark 11:11, go over into your gray section, it says, then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, as it was already, what does it say? Late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So Jesus was actually at the temple the night before. If you can see that, say yes. He walks in, he looks around, but is this enough to, if he were to cleanse the temple then, would it be the right timing to provoke the system? Are there enough witnesses? No, everything's shutting down already for the day. It's closing time. Are you with me? So what does he do? He retreats to Bethany, the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, his friends. He spends the night there and decides to come back and do his premeditated work in the temple the next day when it's more crowded. So he comes the next day, he walks in, not a fit of temper, premeditated. He's even slept on it overnight. He's had a good night's sleep on whether or not he should do this or not. And he comes in, and what is he doing but bringing the way, listen to what I'm saying, of sacrificing innocent victims to an end. Jesus is not cleansing the temple here. He's bringing it to an end. He's not cleansing it of corruption so that it can continue on. He's causing the way of sacrifice to cease. He's saying it's done. We're no longer going to operate politically, religiously, or economically after the way of sacrificing innocent victims for the benefit of the masses. Now, were there those being benefited by the temple service in that day? Yes. I find great comfort in the fact that in Revelation 21, verse 22, in the new heavens and the new earth, it says, I saw, what does it say? No temple. The world that Jesus is coming to create will not be rooted in sacrifice, sacrificing innocent victims. Look at it in Matthew 9:13. Go and learn what this means, Jesus says. I desire what? Mercy, not what? Think about it. Did Jesus come to unify humanity? But he came to unify humanity not around sacrificing innocent people, but through learning, teaching us the way of mercy, how to love our enemies. Napoleon said, this is actually what, Napoleon Bonaparte, he said, this is actually what sets Jesus apart in history. He says, all the great men like Charlemagne and Alexander the Great, they have always unified human beings against a common enemy. Jesus came to create a human society that was nonviolent and that was unified around mercy, forgiveness, and love for their enemies. I desire the way of mercy, not sacrifice. Matthew 12:7, but if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Hosea 6:6 is where Jesus was getting it from. For I desire what? Mercy, not sacrifice, and the acknowledgement of God rather than in burnt offerings. In other words, instead of sacrificing others, we see that every person is a sacrosanct, a sacred creature. They are the children of God. We acknowledge God in others, and we say we will not sacrifice them anymore. They are the objects of his affection, and we practice the way of mercy instead. In Isaiah 1:11-12, what is it to me, the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord? I've had enough of burnt offerings and rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. He's saying, I don't delight in the way of sacrifice. Sacrifice has always brought you together. It's never appeased me. It's only unified you. When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of your hand? Is this coming from me? Jesus comes and he endeavors to bring the way of sacrifice to an end. I'm asking you to look at it more than just religiously. I'm asking you to look at, remember, the hope of the Hebrew people was to change the way life is done on planet Earth. The way we do life is the way of sacrifice. I don't know what it's like for you here in New Zealand, but I know in America, militarism is a religion in and of itself. We sacrifice our young generation to prove we're worthy of the sacrifices that were made in previous generations. But it is another religion, so to speak, built on sacrifice. Do you see it? Jesus came to bring, and it doesn't matter in what area, he came to bring the way of sacrifice to an end. He doesn't desire the world to be orchestrated around sacrificing, but on the way of mercy. Go back to Mark 11. When Jesus cleansed the temple, brought the temple to an end, it says the chief priests And the teachers of the law heard this, and as soon as they heard what he had done, they began looking for a way to what? To kill him. Who was it that began looking for a way to kill him? The chief what? Priests and the teachers of the... Why? Because who were they in this temple system? Think of the pyramid. Who were they? The ones being benefited by it. For they feared him, it says. Were they being threatened by this new world Jesus was coming to create? And because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. So now he's starting to gather a following. The crowd is abandoning their way of arranging life and beginning to follow him. In John 11, 47 through 50, the rest will be quicker. It took a long time to unpack this so you can see the narrative here. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting and a council. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and destroy our holy place and our nation. Remember the fear of foreign threat? We talked about this on Tuesday night. If we follow Jesus, this will allow the Romans to just come in and wipe us out. Caiaphas said, but one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, "You don't know how this works. You don't know anything at all. You don't understand." Notice the way of sacrifice. It is better for you to have, what does it say? One man die for the people than to have the whole nation be... What is he doing at that moment? What I want to remind you of the narrative truth here. Jesus doesn't say, if you've seen Caiaphas, you've seen the Father. Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Caiaphas is not revealing the character of God here. Caiaphas is revealing the way of the who? The way of the Satan, the way of the world, the way that the present world is arranged, where we sacrifice others so that life as usual. Okay, think about even just last night when we talked about greed and helping the poor. Aren't you tempted, just be honest, aren't you tempted to keep sacrificing the poor and the needy so your life can continue on unchanged? How many were, I won't ask for a raise of hands, but just ask yourself. How many were tempted to say, I'm just going to go on with my life the way I have? And in that moment, you're sacrificing them so that your nation can continue. Do you see it? I don't think Caiaphas was really so concerned for the nation as he was his place of privilege among the way that nation was arranged. In Luke 22:52, who was it that came and arrested Jesus that night? It says the officers of the who? Why the temple police? Why the chief priest? Well, what had Jesus done just a few days previous? He had brought the temple way of sacrifice to an end so that it couldn't continue. So the temple police finally come and arrest him through Judas, yes. In Luke 23:12, it says that day Herod and who? Pilate became what? Before this, they had been, this is the way of the world. They were enemies, competing interests in Rome. And yet on that day, they became friends around a common enemy. Do you see the way of sacrifice here? It says, Mark 15:15, wanting to satisfy the who? The crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The one that was satisfied by the death of Jesus was not an angry God. The reason Jesus was crucified was to satisfy the crowd that had been manipulated by Herod, Pilate, and Caiaphas. It was to see, the cross is not where justice was satisfied in the story. The story is whispering to us that the cross was to satisfy the crowd in the most unjust act that humanity had ever, the most unjust atrocity that humanity had ever committed. Because now, who is voluntarily becoming the victim of our way of scapegoating? Who's voluntarily becoming that victim? Yes, and who was Jesus? This is God himself. Why is God himself coming down and willingly placing himself in the hands of angry sinners? Why is it? Because if he doesn't die, he abides alone. But if he dies, if he's willing to do this, he will bear much fruit. And what is that fruit? It's to wake us up. How many of you have been woken up this week to the way of life that you have been doing in this way of arranging life to see that, man, there could be a different way of arranging life here on planet Earth? How many have seen that? And yet, this is why Jesus is dying. His death and his life have the same purpose. It's to wake us up, to lead us away from the ruler of this world who has taken us captive and following his way to following the way of Jesus. It says in Luke 23:34, and this is Jesus' response, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are," what? Scapegoating only works if we really believe that our scapegoat is truly to blame, is truly guilty. They did not know what they were doing. The unjust execution of Jesus must not be looked upon as the victory of God. God had not been victorious yet. On Friday night, someone had just stood up to those systems once again, and what did those systems do like it had done so many times previous? What did those systems do? Crush the threat. So who had won on Friday night? The unjust systems. The politics driven by violence. The economics driven by greed. The religion dependent upon fear. They had won once again because they had killed the threat. They had killed their victim. They had killed the scapegoat, the sacrifice. Friday night, this is nothing more than the victory of those threatened powers yet again, with yet another victim being sacrificed. And what makes the gospel so different? I mean, haven't those systems killed other sacrifices previous to this? Why is the gospel so different? If the story ended here, would the story be any different than when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated or Gandhi himself was assassinated? Would it be any different from those stories? No. Just another story where the powers won. The people at the top of the pyramid won. But how many are thankful that the story doesn't end on Friday night? Because how does the story end? The gospel story is not that someone died. The gospel story is not just that someone came back to life. The gospel story is the story concerning a specific person who threatened the systems of this world more than any other person ever had, who was crucified by those systems, and yet whom the God of this universe stood in solidarity with and brought him back to life. The gospel is the way of the world has been significantly challenged by who? By who? By who? By God himself. And the death and resurrection of Jesus is the beginning of a whole new world. Can you sense it? It's the beginning of doing life differently. It's not, once again, just that someone died, not just that someone resurrected. It's that a specific person was executed and that specific person was brought back to life by God. That's what set in motion the radical change in the first century. Jesus did not come to start a religion. He came to start a revolution that would change how life is orchestrated. In Acts 2:22, this is the message of the early church. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with deeds of power and wonders and signs that God did through him among you, as you yourselves know, this man, given to you according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you what? He was the gift of God to you. And what did you do with that gift? You crucified it. You killed it killed by the hands of those outside the law. But what's the gospel? But God did what? Raised him up, having freed him from death, because it was impossible for him to be held in its power. God has, what does it say? Raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. Therefore, let the entire house of Israel know with certainty that God has made him, this one that you crucified, He has made him both Lord and Messiah, this Jesus whom you crucified. The story of the resurrected one marks the end of sacrificial systems that demand the death of those who are innocent, whether political, relying upon violence, religious, based on fear, or economics driven by greed. It puts on display, watch this, that the presence of God, where did the Hebrew people believe the presence of God was to be found? Do you remember? In the temple. What part of the temple? The most holy place. What the Jesus narrative proves, when Jesus said it was finished, do you remember what happened to that veil? It was ripped in half, and when everybody finally was able to see inside of that most holy place, what did they discover? It was empty. God's presence on that day was not to be found in the most holy, exclusive places of those sacrificial systems. The presence of God that day was to be found in the one who was hanging shamefully upon a Roman cross, being executed by those systems. Do you see the difference? The presence of God is to be found no longer in those most holy places. And in politically, don't all countries say God is on our side? Don't they? I don't know if New Zealand does. Do you guys, when you say God's on your side? We say God defend New Zealand, yes. In America, we say God bless America. In England, they say God save the Queen. We used to say that. I struggle with all of that because if these countries go to war, which side is God going to pick? What the story of Jesus is saying is that God is not on the side of those systems. God is on the side of those whom those systems are destroying. God is with the oppressed, the victims of injustice and violence. And we are with God when we are with them. Do you see it? This is what the cross is saying. God is not to be found in the most sacred places of those systems any longer. God is to be found in the one being revealed through the one that is shamefully suspended on a cross by those systems. God stands in solidarity with the oppressed. And when we see that, if you really believe that, how many can see that if someone really believed that, that has the power to change the world? How many can see that? It has the power to set in motion a new way of arranging how life is done on this planet. And some would say, well, Herb, but if we stand up against those systems, they're just going to crucify us too. Jesus says, if you want to be my follower, take up your... And he wasn't talking about a piece of jewelry. The resurrection is the start of a whole new world where we need not fear the consequences of our engagement against those powers. We stand in the victory of Christ over all injustice, the victory of the resurrection, a victory which has already been won. The great Mahatma Gandhi wrote this: a man who is completely innocent offered himself as a sacrifice for the good of others, including his enemies, and he became the ransom of the what? The world. It was a perfect act. That was Gandhi's opinion of Jesus' death. In what sense was Jesus' death a ransom? Is there like a little guy in a red jumpsuit running around somewhere and Jesus gave him a payment so that he would let us go? Is that how Jesus was a ransom? Or did it require the death of God himself becoming our victim to wake up to what our way of sacrificing others is capable of doing? How it took the death of God to rescue us. Look at Acts 3 and we'll wrap it up. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus. You handed him over to be killed. You disowned him before Pilate, though he had decided to let him go. You disowned the Holy One, the Righteous One, and asked that a murderer be released to you. You killed the author of life. But what did God do? But God raised him from the dead, and we are all witnesses. Acts 13, 32 through 33, we tell you the good news. This is the good news. This is the gospel according to the early church. What God promised our ancestors. What had God promised the Hebrew ancestors? That He would one day come and He would put all injustice, oppression, and violence to right. What God had promised the ancestors, He has, what's that word? Fulfilled for us, their children, by what? By raising up Jesus from the dead. It's not His death alone that saves us. It's His death and resurrection. Now again, if your focus is just on getting to heaven, we've talked about this, then what you'll do is you'll come up with the religious belief that only requires the death of Jesus. Are you with me? But if we're talking about actually changing the world, then we have a story where God Himself becomes the victim of the way this world is presently operating. And He comes back to life saying, enough of this, this is done. His answer over and against the way this world is presently operating is a victorious triumph over that violence, saying it's time for a new way of doing life here on earth. In Acts 5:30-31, the God of our ancestors raised up Jesus from the dead, whom you killed by hanging Him on a cross, and God exalted Him to His own right hand as a prince and as a what? What the resurrection accomplished was that earth now has a new king. There's a new kingdom that has come to town. God's kingdom is present here. Do you believe that? It's already begun. Do we have time? Oh, no, we don't. If you're at home watching this online, get the DVD. If you have to go, get the DVD. Matthew 27:41-46. In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, the elders, they began mocking Him. He saved others, they said, but He can't save Himself. He's the King of Israel. Notice how they're saying that. Are they saying, yes, He's the King of Israel, we'll follow Him? Is that what they're saying? Or are they mocking Him like, yeah, right, He's the King of Israel. He's the King. Let Him come down from the cross and we will believe in Him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if He wants him. For He said, I am the Son of God. By the way, who was also called the King of Israel and also bore the title of God's Son? Do you remember who it was? He wrote most of the Psalms? David. Okay. Was there ever... See, they're saying, look at Jesus hanging on a cross. He who is hung on a cross is accursed of God, forsaken of God. How can He be the King of Israel? How can He be the Son of God if He's in this state right now? And so how does Jesus respond? Jesus quotes the King of Israel from long ago. He quotes David, who was also called God's son, where David himself said, and he quotes it first, he quotes David first in the Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That's a direct quote. And then Matthew interprets it for us, which means, my God, why have you what? Did David ever appear to be forsaken of God? Yes. And was he still king? And was he still God's son? So were we to go by the appearances of Friday night? No. Go by what's proclaimed to us Sunday morning. Look at it in John 12:28. Remember, Jesus said, Father, glorify your what? Your name. Is the name of God glorified through the death and resurrection of Jesus? Is your picture of God changed through the death and resurrection of Jesus? One example is what we just mentioned. We see that God is not necessarily on the side of these systems that are sacrificing others. God is to be found in the ones that are being sacrificed. Do you see it? Does that glorify God? Does that change your picture of God? Listen, I can say this because I'm from there. America is so wealthy right now, not because God is blessing her. America is so wealthy because of the rape and pillaging that she is doing globally on other parts of the country. That is not the blessing of God. Are you with me? But would those at the top of that system want those at the bottom to believe it's the blessing of God and everything's okay? The cross challenges all of that. and says, no, God is not there, God's over here. Luke 23:43, Jesus turns to the thief on the cross and says, today you'll be with me where? In paradise. I love this. And in the Greek, it actually means this. He's saying to the man on the cross, today you're going to be with me in paradise. That's what the Greek says. Now this produces so many challenges for people because they read this statement like a Greek. When did Greeks in Hellenism, when did they think they would experience paradise? When they died. That's when the Greeks believed they would experience. They would die and go to heaven. And so or to paradise. People say, well, is Jesus saying he's going to die and take this thief with him to paradise? That's reading this like a Greek. He's a Hebrew. When did the Hebrews believe that paradise would be restored? When God came to put it all to right. Paradise was their word for Eden. What he's saying to the thief on the cross is, today you are going to be with me as Eden comes once again. This is the beginning of a whole new world. The first world began in a garden. Do you know that narrative? The Hebrew narrative? It began in a garden with a woman being deceived. And women have been having to pay for that sociologically ever since. How does the new world begin? Whom does Mary mistake Jesus for being? Do you know the story? Tell me there are some Jesus followers in the room. Do you know the Jesus story? Whom does Mary mistake Jesus for being at the tomb? The gardener. The tomb is in a... So the new world begins in a garden, just like the old one. But notice the parallels that John draws. The new world, the old world began with the woman being deceived. The new world begins with the woman being the first to be enlightened to whom Jesus is. And he commissions her as the apostle to the apostles. Go tell the brethren this good news. New world has begun. How many think that's beautiful? Women, live in the new world, not the old one. Yes, thank you. Oh, I got to let you go. Oh, one last one. Remember Jesus said the prince will be driven out? Look at his commission in Matthew 28. Yeah, and then we're done. Oh, yeah, I'll walk you through in like 2 seconds the rest. Matthew 28, 18 through 20. When Jesus came to them, he said, watch this. All what? Authority in heaven and on earth has been what? Who's he quoting there? He's quoting someone. Who's he quoting? Do you remember? He's quoting the devil. Hey, isn't this the same thing the devil had said to him in the wilderness? All authority of the whole world has been given to me. What he's saying is now, post-death and resurrection, all authority has been given to who? To me. He won the world back from the devil. And he says, now go and make disciples, instructing them in the practice of everything that I have taught you. New world has begun. And I will be with you every step of the way till this age is brought to its end. Has the new world begun in Jesus? Yes. Is it present unobstructed? There's a lot of obstruction still. The unobstructed world of Jesus is still in the future. Are you with me? But we're called to enlarge the kingdom toward that day so that you don't have to go through it. Again, we've talked to this so much before. Modern Christianity is focused on post-mortem change. They say, which will you spend eternity, smoking or non-smoking? You tell some people, I'm going to become a Christian, and they say, that's nice, because for most people, that doesn't mean anything. Nothing's going to change. You'll just go to church once a week, but everything else will remain the same. If I were to tell my friends today that I were going to become a vegan, most of my friends would say, don't do that. You can't eat this, you can't eat this, you can't eat that, you can't eat this. But if I tell them I'm going to become a Christian, they say, that's nice. Do you catch the tragedy in that? We have settled for such a domesticated version of Jesus, so focused on post-mortem realities, so devoid of an interest in any change in the here and in the now, both in us and in the world, that it is more demanding to become a vegan than it is to follow Jesus. Do you get that? God save us. God forgive us. We argue over a post-mortem fire insurance policy, and then we argue over what the premium for that policy really is. Think about that. Jesus is asking us to be focused on enlarging the kingdom in the here and in the now. Again, the kingdom of heaven is not a kingdom in heaven, it's a kingdom from heaven come to earth in the person of Jesus Christ. It is a radical new way of seeing God. How many have experienced that this week? It's a radical new way of seeing yourself. How many have seen that this week? And it's a radical new way of looking at everyone else, even those that we've sacrificed. And it is a call to start living life differently. It is a call to start doing life differently based on those paradigm shifts. The cross was never, and I'm just going through the verses. You can read them later. The proof's right there. You can look at it later. The cross would never have been what the early church said Jesus did instead of them. They would never have said Jesus died instead of me. They would have said, yes, Jesus died for me, but he never did it instead of them. The cross was that which they were going to follow Jesus in. And did the early church embrace their cross along with Christ's? The cup that Jesus drank, they would have never said, Jesus drank that instead of us. They would have said, yes, Jesus drank it for us, but we are to join Christ in that cup and drink it too, because this is the way we're going to change the world. How many saw that when we looked at Matthew 5, turning the other cheek, the way of the cross? This is the way we're going to change the world. God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be healed. And in John 20, Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. Do you know what that means? New world has begun. How many are thankful for that? Now, be honest, when you look around, does it look like the new world has begun? But this is why we walk by faith and not by what? Walking by faith instead of by sight is not believing in the existence of God, even though you can't see it. Walking by faith instead of by sight is believing that Jesus is the new king of planet Earth when you look around and you see little evidence in your own sphere of influence. Earth has a new king. Do you believe that? Christ's kingdom has come. Do you believe that? It needs to be enlarged one human being at a time, one heart at a time, one relationship at a time. But the new world has begun through the resurrection, and God is sending us into this world just like he sent Jesus. Not to condemn the world, are you with me? But that the world through us might be, what did he say? Saved or healed. We'll talk about Paul on Saturday. We did not derive religious theological beliefs tonight from the Jesus story. We just looked at the story itself. How many of you saw things in the narrative of the Jesus story tonight that you've never seen before? How many saw? You're looking at it with new glasses. Anybody? Everybody over here, you already knew everything I said. Great, fantastic. No, I'm just kidding. I know. I get it. The reason is we focus on this story as getting us to heaven. I want to challenge you to go back and reread this story as the way God is bringing heaven, restoring heaven once again on earth. If you go back and reread it with those glasses, it's a totally different story. Can you sense that? And so I'll close tonight with this. To the degree that we have seen, to the degree that we have looked, we have seen that Jesus is seeking to create a new world that's not based on excluding anyone, but a radical inclusivity of all. We've seen that Jesus is seeking to create a world not rooted in violence, but mercy, forgiveness, and love. We've seen that God is wanting to start a world, create a world where greed no longer exists. And tonight we began to see that God is wanting to create a world where mercy is practiced rather than sacrifice. How many of you tonight would love to be a part of a world, to live in a world that looks like that. It's not someplace that waits for you when you die. It's something you're called to help create today in the here and now. And it may ruin your life. Matter of fact, that's my new motto, if I could be so honest. Follow Jesus, he'll ruin your life. Do you know why I say that? Because which part of the pyramid do I live in? Globally, I live in the top of the pyramid. That's my world. Following Jesus ruins my life. Do you get it? But it's for a better world. So it only looks like it's ruining it. It's not turning my world upside down. It's putting the world right side up again. And so in light of this, even if it ruins your life, even if you lose your life, being a part of creating this new world, how many tonight would like to say, yes, if that's what that Jesus is about. I don't have all the theological questions answered. All I'm looking at is the ethical teachings of Jesus and going out there and putting into practice, endeavoring to be a follower of Jesus. How many would be willing to say tonight, I want to be a follower of a God, of a Jesus like that? How many would be willing to say that? May the new world begin. Let's pray. Precious Heavenly Father, the kingdom starts now. Jesus, you didn't come to, once again, start a religion, especially one that would be so violent, especially one that would exclude, especially one that would become so wealthy on the backs of others. You came to start a revolution that would set in motion Eden restored. Father, thank you for your patience with us along this journey as we've been discovering this. Father, would you aid us? We've made decisions this evening that we want to follow you. Would you take that decision? And would you show us what that looks like, what that means? Show us how we can follow you in our daily and individual lives. Show us how we can follow you in our religious communities, our families. And then, Father, show us how we can follow you in the larger society beyond those communities. That new world, Father, it's inspiring. Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for not letting go of us. Thank you for not condemning us and just writing us off. Thank you for never stopping loving us. Thank you that you've always had the dream, not of punishing us, but of restoring us. Father, may we be healed through your work through Jesus Christ. In your precious name we pray all this. Amen. Some of you may be visiting this week and maybe you're bumping into Jesus for the very first time and you've got a whole bunch of hang-ups because you think that if you decide to follow Jesus, that's going to make you like all those other Christians. What I want to encourage you to remember is night number 1, I said that I was going to ask you to be a follower of Jesus. I was never going to ask you to embrace the religion of Christianity. Some of you, one of those questions that's lingering is, well, if I follow Jesus, I've heard about this belief in Christianity that if you don't follow this God that supposedly loves you, he's going to burn you forever and ever. Hear me. God's justice is always restorative. It is never retributive. Some of you are asking, well, Herb, if I follow Jesus, do I have to believe in that Christian teaching of hell? That's been the number one question I've been asked by those who come to these events and say, man, that Jesus is beautiful, but if I buy into this, do I got to believe all that over there? We're just going to pick on one of those over theirs. And that's tomorrow night. If I want to follow Jesus, do I have to believe in hell? Remember, God's justice is restorative, not retributive. Come back tomorrow and we'll look at it then. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Those of you online, thank you for joining us as well. Thank you for your patience with the duration this evening and its length. All of you, we'll see you tomorrow night. Be safe going home. God bless you. Go out and love like the sun shines, love like the rain falls, and go enlarge the kingdom. We'll see you tomorrow. I love you guys.